big rat pipe.
Ready? Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
Surely Johnny hasn't made you nod off, has he? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening, Ethel.
Still awake. Well, a year's gone by. Can hardly believe it since I last sat here chairing a panel such as this, and indeed since I formally became part of the Essex Community Foundation as a trustee. And I just wanted to steal a tiny bit of time by saying what a great experience it's been. I know that the new trustees will be hoping that it's a great experience. Well, I can tell you now that it has really been a fabulous year. And I can't tell you how much pleasure I've got from working with such a great group of people. And I know that Claire and my fellow joiner Charles would join with me in that. So thank you everybody for making the last 12 months so easy and making us feel so welcome. Let's look then at the last 12 months. And as Dame Kate mentioned, what a 12 months it's been. Now, sadly, we're not going to discuss the Leicester City victory, although she may want us to, I'm not sure. Or, sadly, Andy Murray. But we thought we'd have a little look for the next few minutes at some of the tumultuous political events that have happened, Brexit, the Trump victory as well, and also the background of continued austerity, continued savings, as some people put it, cuts as other people term them. And even, if you think back as well over the last 12 months, charities themselves, some of whom have had a pretty bad press. They've come under the spotlight for some of their donor recruiting practices, shall we say. So what effect have these had, and indeed will they have, on philanthropy, on charities, and indeed on those in need, both here in Essex, that's what we really, really care about, but also in the UK beyond and in the wider world as well. So, to talk about this, I'm really delighted to introduce to you, to my right, Fabian French, who is the Chief Executive Officer of UK Community Foundations, as Johnny explained earlier, the umbrella organisation for the Community Foundation. Dan Corrie, who is from New Philanthropy Capital, and also Professor Heather Laurie, who's Professor of Sociology and Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Research at the University of Essex. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel. So panel, that's what I'm going to call you from now on. Let's just start with a few initial thoughts then. It's a bit of a wide question, but if we can try and contain ourselves ever so slightly. So let's look at these events as a whole. Quite a lot, as Kate mentioned, of political and economic uncertainty. How do you then see the role of of philanthropy, of volunteering, and indeed of the voluntary and community sector developing? So how much pressure will there be, do you feel, on those? I'll start with you, Fabian.
Well, there are lots of reasons why people voted in favour of Brexit, and lots of reasons why people voted for Donald Trump. But to many, those were both surprising results. And many people feel that part of the reason for those votes was a sense of disillusionment, disenfranchisement, disappointment with the establishment, with the established political order. And so you've got millions of people in America, millions of people in this country who are disengaged and disappointed. And I think that creates a huge challenge for the voluntary sector. And actually I think in this country it creates a huge challenge for community foundations, because if we can find a way of, through working in their communities, giving those people a sense of ownership of the things they feel alienated from, then we will make a significant change. So I think it's depressing on the one hand, but I think there's quite a lot of potential. I think community foundations are part of the solution.
All right, Fabian, thank you. Dan?
Well, I think obviously Fabian's right. I think what we're going to have is a period of uncertainty. I mean, we really don't quite know what has happened. We don't really know what people were trying to say. The 52% who voted Brexit, and we don't know how things will pan out. There's a lot of talk about the charity sector, the voluntary sector, being quite important in, if you like, kind of mending some of the sort of fissures, if you like, that have been created in society. And in some areas, voluntary sector is very good at doing that. It's not always great at that. But I think, so all that is change, and exactly how it's going to work out and affect philanthropy in the voluntary sector is a bit unclear. I think one thing, though, that is clear, we had the autumn statement recently, and despite the rather interesting that we had a Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer talking about a 90% debt to GDP ratio, quite extraordinary, and then not sort of cutting back. On the other hand, he didn't really change anything on austerity, and there was some signs that he might have, and he didn't. And so one thing we do know is that money's going to stay tight in the public sector, particularly for local authorities, probably for the NHS, in social care. So all the things that philanthropy is being asked, if you like, to sort of keep going, because to the extent it was funded by the public sector, that really just isn't there. That's going to continue. So that's one certain thing. I think the rest is a bit uncertain, and we've got to keep our eye to the ground, see what's happening, and try and understand whether the demands on us as a sector have changed.
Thank you, Dan. Heather, Dan mentioned there the autumn statement, and we were having a discussion before we came to the floor this evening about the jams, the people who are just about managing, and this came out of the autumn statement, and about who are they? Who are these people who are just about managing? Are they, what sort of level
that's
of
right. I mean, this was a new
experiencing?
term that sort of entered the lexicon, if you like, the just about managing category of people. And these are people who are not in severe poverty, but who are getting by, probably working, but on relatively low incomes. But they don't have a lot of spare money at the end of the month. They don't have a lot of additional money to pay for their children to do additional activities outside of school, those types of things. So they are just about managing. And one of the interesting questions I've been talking about with the foundation is at the university, we run a very large longitudinal study where we follow people over time. And we were talking about actually doing a piece of research to look at who are those people who are falling into that category. Do they remain in that category for a long period of time? Because it's very debilitating if you're just about scraping by over a long period of time compared to just a short period where maybe there's a problem with unemployment or ill health or something of that sort. So it'll be a very interesting piece of research to do, to look at that and to see within Essex, with the rather diverse population that we have in terms of very affluent communities set quite closely against quite deprived communities, how that looks across the county as a whole. So I think it would be a really interesting project to do.
Heather, thanks very much. So let's look at some of these events then in isolation, and we'll sort of go to the most recent event. Apart from the autumn statement, we'll go to the most recent event first. So we'll talk about the US election result. Now, some people might think, well, what has that ever done for me? Some people might be quite concerned about the effect on philanthropy. Dan, what's the difference between the US view of philanthropy and how the result might affect things there, as opposed to the UK view?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, US philanthropy is characterized in some ways by much more strategic philanthropy. So you get the sort of famous philanthropists like Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and so forth, who tend to say, I want to solve a problem, and I'm going to fund to sort of solve that problem, and I'll find some organizations that will help me. I might fund some new ones to create, and they take a very sort of active role. Not all philanthropy in the US is like that. In fact, most of it isn't. When you come to the UK, traditionally our philanthropy is much more, if you like, responsive. It's trying to just fund good organisations that need some money. And philanthropy in this country has tended not to get involved in trying to advocate so much for issues. And that'll be interesting how it plays out, because I think in the US, if you heard some of the people talking about why they voted for Trump or they were fed up, philanthropy almost was classed as part of that kind of elite who spend their lives in Davos or something, or whatever it is that people think that they do. So I don't think that's happened in the UK. So in a sense that helps philanthropy. On the other hand, it may well be that philanthropic institutions and funders want to speak out a little bit on behalf of the people that they give grants to. And I was talking recently to a well-known, well-established big British foundation who for the first time have appointed someone to be their sort of policy and advocacy person, because they feel that they're seeing a lot of what's happening on the ground in the people that they fund, and they would like to sort of add to that volume a little bit to talk about it, because I think it's not getting through the government, whether it's about the jams or anybody else. So it's a different world, but we may face some of the same pressures.
That's really interesting. Fabian, do you think that the community foundations themselves, as a body, should stick their head above the parapet and try and influence government policy?
I think so. I think we are very good at analysing need and seeing where the problems are, and we're not always as good as we should be at communicating that to the influencers and opinion formers. So yes, I think that should be an ambition, Italy. What I also think is that UK Community Foundations, the organisation I run, has a responsibility on behalf of the whole network to raise issues with government. And we've just appointed an external affairs head whose role it will be to identify specific policy issues and talk to think tanks, politicians and so on to raise the awareness of those.
I know that you've described the whole concept as an oil tanker, that you're trying to, do you try and push against the oil tanker and change its course, or do you nimbly row around it in your kayak, just
That's right.
clipping at its heels? If you can do that
Government
with an oil
policy is the
tanker.
super tanker and community foundations the kayaks. We didn't get the analogy. The answer is we can affect policy a bit, but it will take a long time. I mean, one good example is that the first person who was invited to meet the Prime Minister's new Special Advisor on Charities, I'm delighted to say, was our organisation. So, you know, we've got the ear of somebody in number 10 Downing Street, that's great, but it will take a while.
Haven't been to see Donald Trump yet, though.
Not yet. But the other point is that we community foundations need to be nimble, and we need to spot specific issues and work out how to address them without waiting for the super tanker to turn. So I think nimbleness is the key thing.
Thank you. Heather, obviously one of the repercussions of the Trump victory has been this economic volatility, and that looks at the moment, as again Dame Kate mentioned, set to continue. So how do you see the challenges for communities here in Essex panning out as far as that's concerned? How do these two come together? What's the knock?
Well, I mean, I think there's just a huge amount of uncertainty, and you know, we've got the Trump being elected, we have the Brexit vote, and we're really very, very unclear exactly what that's going to do to the economy of the UK, let alone to the economy of Essex. I mean, in some respects, you would expect Essex to be quite resilient as a county as a whole. It's close to London, and it's by no means the poorest county overall in the UK, but it does have pockets of really severe deprivation, quite, you know, stark pockets of deprivation that are very persistent, and actually the data show are getting worse over time rather than better. So there are some very, very severe social problems coming up. And I think one of the big issues is about how we maintain social cohesion across our communities when you do have differences in levels of income that can be quite stark. And we need to talk, you know, use the voluntary sector a lot, I think, to sort of enhance that social cohesion.
And one of the things I wanted to chat with you about as well was some of that sort of train of thought whereby people say that both the Brexit result and the US election result were based on campaigns of fear. We've heard a lot of talk about that. And about a negative attitude towards things like immigration, unfortunately a rise in xenophobia, a rise in reported racist incidents, and that terrible tragedy we had here in Essex, in Harlow, of course, where a man lost his life. So how do we tackle that within the Essex communities and try and make sure it's not happening?
Well, I mean, I think it's a really difficult problem. I mean, certainly I think that a lot of people did vote on the basis of fear rather than on the basis of reality in their communities. But on the other hand, you know, there's a positive aspect to the fact that a lot of the people who have never voted before, who never vote, who never take part in the political process, on this occasion actually did. And that's a good thing. But what you want to be able to do is somehow engage that care that they have for their community. That's what they were saying. They were saying, we are concerned about our community. You need to try and engage that in a more positive way rather than it just focusing on, you know, xenophobia and whoever looks like the outsider who can be blamed for whatever social problems they have. I mean, I think a really interesting statistics that's in the Vital Signs report is that in Essex as a whole, per 1,000 residents in Essex, there were only 4.7 immigrants into Essex who were non-UK born. So it's actually a very tiny number, but the perception is that it's a very large number. And of course that's driven by some communities that have had much higher proportions of immigration than others. And that's where that comes from. So.
Dan, what about your concerns then for this potential division of community?
Well, I think we should be a bit worried about somehow something seems to happen which has allowed certain people to sort of, if you like, release perhaps some of their worst thoughts.
Exactly.
You know, and we saw after the Brexit vote sort of slightly, you know, strange behaviour with people going up to sort of people who look foreign and asking them why they were still here. Hadn't we just voted to chuck them out? And all that sort of thing has got a bit legitimated. And I think that, you know, the voluntary sector has a role in trying to do something about that in different ways. I mean, one of the issues, though, that I tend to feel that the voluntary sector is, the charity sector and philanthropy is a bit of an answer to this. On the other hand, community groups often, in the jargon, are much more about bonding social capital. They bring people with the same interests together, but they're not necessarily about the bridging social capital which joins communities. And I think as you think about your funding, and as I think as public sector thinks about it, funding as well, how can you fund things which help to bring communities together? But I would say, I think one of the other things about the vote, though, was that people feeling very lost in this sort of globalised world. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate this. Remember, 48% voted for staying in, and the 52 were very divided on exactly what they were voting about. But nevertheless, there was a sort of feeling that their community has got lost in this globalised world. I think Theresa May's comment about, you know, if you're a citizen of the world or something, you're a citizen of nowhere. And that tells you that people want to feel part of their community, actually, and that's very important to them. And I think that gets you back down to this as a smaller voluntary sector community groups are very, very important. As we know, they're struggling with core costs and all that kind of stuff at the moment. So it seems a very important role to play.
Let's talk about that, because I mean, it always seems like ages ago, and we've probably almost forgotten now, but charities, I don't know exactly how many months ago, but several months back, prior to all this political upheaval, were getting a bad press, a really, really bad press. Not all of them, it has to be said, not all of them by any means, but some of the bigger national charities, there was a great spotlight on some of their, as I mentioned, some of their ways of garnering donations and donors. Do you think we're coming out of the other side of this now, or has it been forgotten about?
I'm not sure that we are. I mean, there's a whole big change. I was actually just at a meeting today with the new fundraising regulator, who's going to try and make sure that what happened with the Olive Cook case.
This was the lady, you probably remember yourself, sorry to interrupt, but this is the lady Olive Cook who sadly took her own life, and it was alleged that it was due in part by the pressure that charities had put on her, demanding money over the telephone. Whether that was the case or not, we're not quite sure.
And I think some charities were doing absolutely the wrong thing in the way they were trying to or pressurise people into donating. And so we've got a new regime coming in, which will be difficult for some of the big charities. As I understand it as well, though, that we've got the Information Commissioner lurking around in the charity sector and is going to say some things about the way they've been using data. So I think it is a problem, and it's the trouble in charities, anyone who's involved in a charity at all, is you're always worried about funding. And I think the bigger charities have got to get control of their fundraising regimes, particularly where they're fundraising from the general public. And, you know, we say at my organisation, we want to have, if you like, the sort of grand test. Never do anything in your fundraising that you would not want someone pressurising your gran about. And, you know, this is a moral and cultural thing. And so we're going to change the rules, but I still worry that some of the bigger charities You know, they just need the money coming in. They're seeing it dropping off in other places, and they will push. And unfortunately, it's contaminated the whole sector. Most charities aren't doing any of this sort of stuff, but there's been a little bit of people doubting, and we get this a bit from philanthropists after the Kids Company affair, if you followed that at all. And some philanthropists saying, well, maybe all these voluntary sector organisations are a bit useless. Should I really be funding them? And that's very dangerous.
Fabian, what sort of knock-in effect have you noticed in regard to this? And also, has perhaps some of this adverse publicity towards the bigger national charities actually done, you know, nobody likes to see anyone taking the advantage, but has that done local charities good?
Well, I think the criticism, justified criticism of large charities has affected trust in the sector, and what charities have, their USP, is the trust that they have with their supporters. So I think it's a very negative thing. That said, I have a sense that the pendulum is swinging slightly away from the big charities because they are the ones who've behaved really pretty badly. And there's an increasing awareness that small charities make a large difference. I mean, it's terrifying what a percentage of philanthropy in the UK goes to the big branded charities. People like to give to organisations they've heard of. And it may be that that will change a bit as a result of some of these scandals. And reflecting on Kids Company, which I think is a very interesting example, that is a perfect example of complete failure of governance.
Everyone remembers that story, I presume, yeah?
Where in terms of the chief executive overreaching their authority, poor control by the trustees, particularly the chairman, and so on, and bad financial management. It's a textbook example of everything going wrong. The great thing about community foundations is that we've got corporate governance coming out of our ears. We have this rather painful 3-year quality accreditation process, which I know Caroline really enjoys, not. But it allows us to say to our supporters, whether the supporters in this room or government who entrusts UKCF to manage programmes through the network, that we have got corporate governance to the nth degree. So I think there's something that we can take out of it. But these are silver linings. I think it's tragic how the whole sector has been criticised and that it's justified.
Thank you very much. So all of these events, of course, over the background of general austerity, so less funding from the public sector to support the work of the voluntary services. At the same time, charities telling us that the demands on them quite naturally are going to be more and more and more, demand for services increasing. So a tension between the charities potentially and the public sector as we redefine our relationship in the absence of funding. Heather, you've touched on some of the need in Essex. Now I know that we could probably talk about this for the rest of the evening, but can you just put us in the picture really as far as Essex goes, and where those pockets of need are, and how much need there is?
Well, I mean, if you look at tendering as an area, I mean, on almost every statistic you look at, it's doing significantly worse than the rest of the county. So you have some real pockets of deprivation there. If you look at issues of, for example, tendering has got the highest percentage of children living in poverty, 23.6% compared to the rest of the county. In Basildon, it's 21.5%. I mean, this is a fifth of children living in poverty, which can't be right in an affluent society. And also tendering has the highest proportion of young people classified as not in education, employment or training. So they're effectively doing nothing. 8.7% of young people living in tendering. So I think, you know, there are some really quite deep social problems there for our younger people, but then at the other end of the age scale, there's quite a large elderly population in Essex. Social care needs are going to continue to rise. Social care across the UK as a whole is heading for a real crisis, and you know, it's going to hit Essex perhaps in the same way as everywhere else, or even worse, given the age distribution in the population here. And so, I mean, there's going to be a lot of call on the voluntary sector to fill these gaps, both for support for children in early years education and different areas like that, as well as at the other end of the age scale for people who need help with their social care, ill health needs, disability needs, and so on. So I think the voluntary sector is going to come under a lot of pressure over the next few years.
Fabian, I doubt you would disagree with that. What's your take on it?
The demographics are changing, and society has changed. 2 generations ago, it was the extended family and the neighbourhood network who would look after the people who have just been described. The last generation, it was really the local authority, social services who were funding it, and now the burden of that has fallen fair and square on the shoulders of the voluntary sector, and I think particularly for the kind of organisations like community foundations. So I think it's putting an increased burden on us. But on the other hand, if we can use this data to shock us out of the complacency that a lot of us feel, then that will be a good thing and will lead to more money coming in and improvements being made. But
And
that data's
still
truly
plenty of room for philanthropy in the county then?
There is, and I think, you know, the thing I worry about, despite these big charities being the ones that got in on the crisis, they will be fine on funding. I mean, it's the smaller charities in particular that used to pick up a bit of money in grant funding from bits of the public sector, whether that was the NHS or the local authority. And they have lost that, and they find that very difficult. They don't need much money, so some of the small grants that you give out are incredibly important just to allow them to keep going. I think that's very, very important. And also, though, I mean, I'm very, very enthusiastic about, if you like, what community foundations do, which is geographically focused philanthropy, because you know your patch really well. And it's a very hard thing for a big national foundation to work out who is a good little organisation, who isn't. How do they do the due diligence? And to some extent, having local knowledge, and you know this is an organisation that actually is quite good without us overdoing due diligence and metrics. I love metrics, but you don't want to overdo it with little organisations. And we also know that if this one keeps going, it's really playing an important role in the glue of the community, or with some older people, and you just know that. And so that's very, very important. We can't pretend that philanthropy can solve all these problems. And I think we've got to be very careful if we ask too much of it and then say, oh, it failed. We can't do everything. And a lot of philanthropists, and I don't know if you worry about this, worry that they're being asked to fund things that basically the state ought to fund, really. And is it your job just to fund the things that the state has decided it won't fund anymore? Or do you want to be funding more innovative things and so forth? And a lot of philanthropists worry about that. They're being asked to do a job that they shouldn't be being asked to do.
So, we'll sum up by looking ahead. Sometimes it's difficult to look ahead to the next 20 minutes at the moment, let alone the next 20 years. But this year, of course, Essex Community Foundation, as we well know, celebrated its 20th anniversary. Heather, just paint a very brief picture of what we can expect in Essex then, as far as the statistics tell us at the moment, but over the next 20 years.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is the population is going to continue to grow. You know, Essex has become a very popular destination for people moving out of London, especially as house prices increase in London and they move out. And that's been a process that's been happening for the last, since the war, and is continuing to happen. So that just puts more pressure on infrastructure. The more people you have, you need the infrastructure in terms of education, health, roads, all of those aspects. And I'm slightly concerned for Essex that, especially in the autumn statement, there was quite an emphasis on funding going towards the northern powerhouse, and I worry a little bit that the east of England is going to get forgotten and won't be as successful in actually getting some of that funding that was talked about in terms of developing industry, innovation, technology, and so on. Because what we really need in Essex is good quality jobs that are children coming through the education system, doing well in the education system, and then staying in Essex and working in Essex in high quality jobs, not leaving the county. We want them to stay.
Heather, thank you. So Dan, that said, how would you foresee the role of the Essex Community Foundation then potentially over the next 20 years?
Well, I think you know, you've got to carry on doing what you're doing, and you're obviously getting bigger at it and better at it, and that's very important. But I just wondered one thing. I think community foundations will become more insight into, for instance, where you see things are going wrong and you're having to fund lots of organisations to pick up the pieces. Don't just fund them, but start sort of thinking about how can we get the services reconfigured and so forth, so that we're not churning out this need which we then fund. And that's a bit more proactive role for you. But I think that's sort of what community foundations do a little bit more in the USA and Canada and so on. And I think a bit more of that would be very, very impactful.
Fabian?
I agree that community foundations need to be strategic, and we are, as community leaders, we can convene and build bridges between different bits of a community, and that's one of the things that Dan's talking about, with which I completely agree. But having said that, I would say that Essex Community Foundation represents all that is good about community foundations. I don't have any favourites, I'm not allowed to, but if I had one, there's a good chance that Essex might be quite high on my list. I think it's really important that Essex Community Foundation carries on doing what it's doing, but thinks strategically, remains passionate and remains energetic and remains nimble. It's important to be able to innovate, and it's important that this organisation, along with others, don't sit on their laurels, however successful they have been and are being.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our discussion. Please thank Fabian French, Dan Corey and Professor Heather Laurie.
Thank you ever so much, Etalie, for leading what I think was a fascinating, engaging discussion that will surely continue over drinks. Thank you, Dan, very much for giving us some clarity on that bigger picture, both affecting the philanthropy and the sector, and to Fabian for confirming that Essex Community Foundation is his favourite community foundation in the UK. We have been recorded. And Heather for highlighting some of the real challenges and opportunities for our communities in Essex. And I'm minded to say that in the words of our founder and president Ian Marks, there is still much more that we can do, and that is what we're going to do over the next coming years. So thank you all so much for coming this evening. I hope that you've really enjoyed yourselves. There, of course, will now be an opportunity for some drinks and conversation, and we ask you to move over and carry on the conversations. Can I just say before, can I ask all of the trustees just to stay here with me for just a moment? But everyone else, please follow the team and go and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much. Thank you.